باب صلاة الكسوف والخسوف والأفزاع. The chapter on kusuf and khusuf, the solar eclipse, the lunar eclipse, and afza, and the times of, that shake people up, right? The calamities or catastrophes, natural disasters, things that scare people. Faza. He says, Sunnah rak'ata. Now there's a few underlying principles. One of the underlying principles is that the basis of non-obligatory, non-required prayer is that they're done on the asl fi nawafil is al-infirad. And the basis of nafil prayer is that they're done on their own, on one's own, right? Number two, the asl of prayer at night is that is done on, it's even more a fortiori done on one's own, because الليل ليس وقت الاجتماع, right? And the basis that nighttime is a time of rest and being on one's own. It's not a time for gathering, and that's a known consideration as well. So he says, and also another consideration is that just from the general principles that haraj is madfu' shar'an, hardship is lifted shar'an, right? So if you had to gather for the night eclipse, it's nighttime, it's a time of rest. Number two, if there's no light, right? When there's an eclipse, there's no light, it will be, there'll be haraj in gathering, and there'll be haraj in returning home. And then, thirdly, evidentially, we see, is there a clear basis for gathering for the lunar eclipse as opposed to the solar eclipse? So Abu Hanifa, predictably, did not deem there to be sufficient evidence. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَسُنَّ رَكْعَتَانْ كَهِيئَةِ النَّفْلِ لِلْكُسُوفِ. It is sunnah to perform 2 rak'ahs like the form of the nafil prayer for the kusuf, for the solar eclipse, which happens by day, right? مِنْ غَيْرِ زِيَادَةٍ فَلَا يَرْكَعُ رُكُوعَيْنِ فِي كُلِّ رَكْعَةٍ بَلْ رُكُوعٌ وَاحِدٌ. Right? So one does not perform 2 ruku's in each rak'ah, and therefore 2 ruku's entails there's no 2 standings, because there are hadiths that indicate that, and the Shafi'is took that thought, the eclipse prayers, they have 2 ruku's, which entails 2 standings. So you recite twice in each rak'ah, and you bow twice. It's simple. That the hadith would either be considered problematic, or at least it's outwardly problematic. Because how often do you bow in each rak'ah? Right? This is established through countless decisive texts. All prayers have 1 ruku' per rak'ah. So here you have a narration related to kusuf that says that you bow twice. Now you either have to look at the hadith as being problematic in its wording, or you interpret the wording. How? This pointing to a lengthy ruku'. That's it. 2 standings, lengthy standing. And that is حمل النص على الوفاق، يعني حمل النص المعارض على الوفاق أولى من حمله على الخلاف. لأنه إن كان مخالفا فيرد. Because if the text goes against the other things, that is not sufficient evidentiary basis to leave what is thabit qat'an, that each rak'ah has 1 ruku', has 1 standing and 1 ruku'. And why do we consider it only to have 1 ruku'? So there is a foundational evidentiary basis, because what is thabit qat'an is one ruku', one standing and one ruku' per rak'ah. There's no basis for that, but there are evidences related to the two thing. They're either considered problematic or they're interpreted. لما راه أبو داود أنه عليه الصلاة والسلام صلى ركعتين فأطال فيهما القيام ثم انصرف وانجلت الشمس فقال إنما هذه الآيات يخوف الله تعالى بها عباده فإذا رأيتموها فصلوا كأحدث صلاة صليتموها من المكتوبة. Because the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith related by Abu Dawud that, because it's come that the Prophet ﷺ prayed 2 rak'ahs and he made the standing in them lengthy. And then when he finished from the lengthy prayer and the sun appeared again, he said, these are but signs by which Allah instills awe in His servants. If you behold these signs, then pray like the most recent prayer that you have prayed of the obligatory prayers. Right? قال الكمال وهي الصبح, and the most recent prayer contextually was referring to the Fajr prayer. Right? فإن كسوف الشمس كان عند ارتفاعها قدر رمحين, because that eclipse took place when the sun had just risen a little bit. وفي السنة أنها بركوع واحد في كل ركعة للكسوف. Right? And in the sunnah, it's also come that it is with one ruku' in each rak'ah for the kusuf, right? Right, for the solar eclipse. ولا جماعة فيها إلا بإمام الجمعة أو مأمور السلطان. And there's no congregation in it except for the Imam of Jum'ah or the one commanded by the Sultan, given permission by the Sultan, either specific permission or general permission. دفعا للفتنة, so fitna does not arise. And likewise, إذا اجتمع المسلمون على, if the Muslims gather, like in non-Muslim lands, for one or multiple people to lead them in it, this is allowed. But you wouldn't do, in our madhab, you wouldn't do Salatul Kusuf individually at home in a private congregation. Right there, you just do it on your own. بلا أذان ولا إقامة ولا جهر, without adhan, without iqama, and the stronger position is that one does not recite out loud. That's the asl. Right? ولا جهر في القراءة فيهما عنده, according to the Imam. خلافا لهما. Right? As opposed to the sahibain. And the relied upon position, as is typical, is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, because that's the asl, is quiet recitation, except where it's established to the contrary. Right? And, and Abu Hanifa's position there, the sahibain, and that also corresponds to the asl. There are narrations that they could hear the recitation of the Prophet ﷺ, would be that they could hear bits of it. Right? But there is khilaf on it. ولا khutbah, and there's no khutbah in it. I mean, there's no khutbah, meaning there's no khutbah required. Right? بإجماع أصحابنا لعدم أمره بالخطبة, because the Prophet did not command to recite a khutbah for it. بل ينادي الصلاة جامعة, rather one calls out the prayer is congregated. جامعة, the prayer is, the congregation for prayer is ready. yeah, or the prayer is about to commence, or other suitable words, right? You don't have to say exactly this, right? And you can say as-salata jami'a, right? Or as-salatu jami'a. Right? Both can be said, as Tahtawi mentions. وَالسُنَّةَ تَطْوِيلُهَا. It's sunnah to elongate the prayer. بِنَحْوِ سُورَةِ الْبَقَرَةِ. With the like of Surah Al-Baqarah. Because the eclipse lasts quite a while. So you recite Surah Al-Baqarah, for example. Now this is the asl. So the asl is the Imam recites quietly. You recite the extent of Surah Al-Baqarah. Right? 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 Meaning, in the first rak'ah, you recite all of Baqarah. I.e., in the second, you recite Ali Imran, for example. Right? Or the equivalent. قال الكمال وهذا مستثنى من كراهة تطويل الصلاة لإمام الصلاة. And this is an exception from the dislikedness of the Imam lengthening the prayer. وَلَوْ خَفَّفَهَا جَازٍ. And if one recites less than this, it is permitted. Right? And this is no longer from the words of Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam. And if one does less than that, it is permitted. Right? ولا يكون مخالفا للسنة. One would not be going against the sunnah. لأن المسنون استيعاب الوقت بالصلاة والدعاء. Because the sunnah is that the time of the eclipse be taken up by prayer and supplication. فإذا خفف إحداهما طول الأخرى. If one does one less, one could elongate the other. ليبقى على الخشوع والخوف إلى انجلاء الشمس. So that one remain in a state of khushu', of reverent awe and humbleness, and khawf and fear and awe of the divine until the sun is clear. Right? And reflection and so on. And you can find elsewhere in Dur with the Hashiyah and other references that between three things, and some of that's coming as well, which is between prayer, recitation, so between prayer, supplication, and tadhkir, and reminder, right? And they included the reminder because sometimes people have only so much devotional energy, so to speak, right? And then they differ in practice. In some lands, they have, it's like the issue of the Sahibain. The position of Sahibain is one recites out loud. The basis is the qawl of the Imam. In some places, they take the position of the Sahibain because the amal or the haraj, because, you have a congregation of people for Salat al-Kusuf, right? Rows and rows of people. Would most people be able to stand for 30 minutes of quiet prayer? Especially, would they be reciting? Right? Just imagine, you say Allahu Akbar, and you stand quietly, silently. Right? So, and some said, no, that's the madhab, deal with it. Right? But others said, and that's a matter where there's ikhtilaf fil fatwa. Many would take the position that yes, in itself, the position of the Imam, that's the asl, but the position of the Sahibain here, especially if the amal in nas, etc. And in that, one needs to be cognizant of what is the practice in different lands and so on, and sometimes it can differ. وَسُنَّةَ تَطْوِيلُ رُكُوعِهَا رُكُوعِهِمَا وَسُجُودِهِمَا. It's from the sunnah to lengthen their ruku' and their sujood. لما روي أن الشمس انكشفت على عهد سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقام فلم يكد يركع ثم ركع فلم يكد يرفع ثم رفع فلم يكد يسجد ثم سجد فلم يكد يرفع وفعل في الركعة الأخرى مثل ذلك. So it's come in the hadith that there was an eclipse during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ stood to pray, and it didn't look like he was going to bow until he did bow, meaning the standing was so long that they thought he wouldn't bow. And then he bowed until it was as if he was not going to raise his head. But then he raised his head, and then it didn't seem that he was going to prostrate until he did prostrate. Right? And then he remained there until it seemed he wouldn't rise. And he did the same in the second rak'ah likewise. أخرجه الحاكم وصححه. Al-Hakim narrated it and he deemed it to be rigorously authentic. The Tasheeh of Al-Hakim in his Mustadrak is not of great evidentiary weight in terms of hadith, unless confirmed. And that's an investigation in Ilm al-Hadith. So generally, the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim is published with the work on top of it of Imam al-Dhahabi, although al-Dhahabi did his work on top of it when he was very young. Right? Because he did Talkhis al-Mustadrak and he comments occasionally. So that's something that comes up in the works of hadith. Sakata anhu al-Dhahabi. Al-Dhahabi did not comment on it. The Muhaddithin differ. That Sukut al-Dhahabi, well, Dhahabi agrees that it's Sahih. That is a confirmation. Al-Dhahabi is silent. Some deemed it, the Sukut al-Dhahabi, that indicates that he does agree. Others said no, it's not. Because he didn't say he was going to he did not state that if he's silent, he agrees. And that's a separate. So anyways, that those things are important. One should know one's ilm al-hadith. They don't sound like you're living on planet bid'ah or something. ثم يدعو الإمام. Then the Imam makes dua. لأن السنة تأخيره عن الصلاة. Because the sunnah, with respect to the eclipse, is to delay the dua from the prayer. And that's the general sunnah as well. The dua comes after the prayer. Right? And جالسا مستقبل القبلة, sitting facing the qibla. إن شاء أو يدعو قائما مستقبل الناس, or one could make dua standing facing the people. قال شمس الأئمة الحلواني وهو أحسن. He said, and that is better من استقبال القبلة, than facing the qibla. Because people have more rights over you than the qibla. Right? Because, and one of the reasons being, the sunnah in gathering is to face those who are gathered. Right? So let's say you're in a dars. So in general, Sidi Abdul Latif, in general, is it better to face the qibla or away from the qibla? No, in general, if you have a choice, if you can face the qibla or not face the qibla, what do you do in general? In general.
Not face the qibla.
No, in general, you should face the qibla. I respectfully disagree. Right? In general, it's recommended to face the qibla. Ashraful jihad. If you have a choice of which direction do you face, right? So you decide that you're living in a place, there's perfect weather. So you're going to set your table. You could put it in any direction. You set your table so that you're facing the qibla. That's optimal, right? And as Imam Zarnuji mentions in Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, it's a proven means for tawfiq in one's studies, that if you can, face the qibla. There's great merit. If you sometimes you can't, then you at least have the wish that if I could, I would face the qibla. There's greater reward. Okay, but if you come to a dars, the teacher, so the qibla is that way, the teacher is facing this way. Imagine if the student sat facing the qibla. The teacher has to say, guys, please look at me. Right? No. Like in a majlis, you sit facing those you're in a gathering with. That applies both to the followers and it applies to the leader. Right? That's one of the reasonings here. That Al-Halwani and others said that it's better to face the people than to face the Qibla. Right? Because we were making dua with them. وَلَوْ اعْتَمَدَ قَائِمًا عَلَى عَصَى أَوْ قَوْسٍ كَانَ حَسَنًا. And if one leans while standing on a staff or a bow, and this asa is straight, the qaws is like a bow. It has a curve in it. It's good. It's good because the Prophet ﷺ leaned against one, right? Also to make it easier for lengthy standing. وَلَا يَصْعَدُ الْمِنْبَرِ لِلدُّعَاءِ. And one does not go upon the minbar for the dua, unless there's a need to. Like if there's a jama' azim, there's a great gathering, for example. وَلَا يَخْرُجْ. And one does not go out, meaning right? Right? وَإِذَا دَعَى يُؤَمِّنُونَ عَلَى دُعَائِهِ. And when the Imam makes dua, they say Ameen to his dua. وَيَسْتَمِرُّونَ كَذَلِكَ حَتَّى يَكْمُلَ إِنْجِلَاءُ الشَّمْسِ. And they continue to do that until the sun becomes fully clear. Right? Right? And there's hadiths about that. Right? Right? But the time, and you can read in Tahtawi, quoting Al-Haddadi from As-Siraj al-Wahaj, that the time for the kusuf prayer is during the eclipse. Even if the sun has started clearing, you can still do it. But if the eclipse has ended, the time for the eclipse prayer is gone. And you can وإن لم يحضر الإمام صلوا أي الناس فرادى. If the Imam doesn't come, then the people pray on their own. ركعتين أو أربعا, whether 2 rak'ahs or 4, في منازلهم, in their homes. In their homes. Of course, if there is but it's permitted to do it in the masjid as well, right? And if there's permission, like if the Imam doesn't come, but there's a known permission for someone to deputize for the Imam, that is fine, right? وكأداء صلاة الخسوف فرادى. And likewise, the khusuf prayer, the lunar eclipse prayer, which happens at night, is done on one's own. لأن القمر خسف مرارا في عهد النبي صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم ولم ينقل إلينا أنه عليه الصلاة والسلام جمع الناس له دفعا للفتنة أي والحرج. Right? Because the moon was eclipsed repeatedly during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It's not related to us, meaning soundly, that the Prophet ﷺ gathered the people for it. Right? And also, in order to avoid fitna. Because gathering people at night would be imposition of hardship for them, and it could result in harm. That they could be theft, etc., because of fear of security. But that's بيان لحكمة عدم أمر ذلك. That's the wisdom for why it was not legislated. وكسوف القمر ذهاب ضوئه. The eclipse of the moon is its light to disappear. والخسوف ذهاب دائرته. Right? So there's 2 terms for Kusufu al-qamar is when the light of the moon becomes hidden, and the khusuf is when the whole orb of the moon disappears, because there's partial and full eclipse, as you may know. وَالْحُكْمُ أَعَمْ, and the ruling is more general than both, right? That the eclipse, whether just a disappearance of the light or disappearance of the whole orb of the moon, both the khusuf applies to. وَكَصَاتِ فُرَادَى لحصول الظلمة الهائلة نهارا والريح الشديدة ليلا كان أو نهارا والفزع بالزلازل والصواعق وانتشار الكواكب والضوء الهائل ليلا والثلج والأمطار الدائمة وعموم الأمراض والخوف الغالب من العدو ونحو ذلك من الأفزاع والأهوال لأنها آيات مخوفة للعباد ليتركوا المعاصي ويرجعوا إلى طاعة الله سبحانه وتعالى التي بها فوزهم وصلاحهم. Right? And likewise, one prays on one's own when there is fearsome darkness by day, or intense winds by night or by day, or other scary events such as or scary catastrophes or calamities or natural disasters, earthquakes and thunders and an unusual manifestation of a lot of stars, or appearance of of extraordinary lights by night. Right? Sometimes these natural phenomena happens that people who are, these remind of inqilab, which reminds one of the end of time, and etc. One is not superstitious about these. Right? These are natural phenomena. They serve as a reminder, right? That the sunnatullah, right? This natural connection of cause and effect is just a mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? To make this life easy. But remember, they remind one, بِيَدِهِ الْأَمْرِ, in His grasp is the affair, all of it. Right? And other phenomenon as well, right? Like extraordinary snow or constant rain or widespread sickness, right? And minhu, and from widespread sickness is the ta'un, right? And there's footnotes about the ta'un, and there's discussion about the relationship between the ta'un and the waba, right? But they use ta'un is a specific type of plague, but they use it also for the general expression of some kind of widespread contagious disease. Right? Right? And some of the ulama said one shouldn't make dua to end plagues because they're mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And who wants the end of mercy? But most of the ulama said it is, and you can read about that. Right? And likewise, other causes of overwhelming fear, like impending fear of the enemy. Right? So, there's a city under siege, for example, the enemy is about to attack. People should, spend their time in prayer. And other such calamities and torments, because these are signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by which servants are shaken to have awe of the divine, so that they may leave sin and return to the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So anytime one worries about, like for example, some pandemic taking place, how much time do you spend following the news on it, and how much time do you pray firstly for yourself? Because say, oh, Allah lift the plague from humanity, etc. The first thing is, the most important thing is to take These are ayat. Right? An ayah, what is an ayah? Al-ayah هو ما يدلك على الله سبحانه وتعالى. Right? They point you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the first thing. These are في كل شيء له آية. In everything there's a sign of Allah. That's a signification. That's the first thing. The second thing is you ask Allah for hifz, but ask Allah for protection even before you ask Him to take heed from it of returning to Allah. You self unprotected yourself there because you didn't. The first person thing is an ayah. Then you ask Allah for hifz, and then you ask yourself. Then you ask Allah for rafa. You thank Allah for what you have, right? But the first thing is these are ayat. Inna fi khalqi samawati wal ard wa ikhtilafi al-layli wan nahar la ayat. Right? That's the first, right? And the purpose of it is to leave sin, return to obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَفِرُّوا إِلَى اللَّهِ. And that's the means of salvation and rectification. That may not be fashionable, but that's what's more important than, okay, what about winter transmission due to moisture in the air, whatever, right? You're infatuated with the sign and you've missed out on its signification. اشتغلت بالآية عن مدلولها. You've busied yourself with the sign away from its madlul, or what it indicates. Then he says, Imam Shumbulai doesn't talk a lot about spiritual matters, but when he does, he says, وَأَقْرَبُ أَحْوَالِ الْعَبْدِ فِي الرُّجُوعِ إِلَى رَبِّهِ الصَّلَاةِ. The closest of states of the servant in their return to their Lord is the prayer. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى من فضله العفو والعافية. We ask Allah from His bounty for overlooking and wellness. بجاه سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right? Right? And then he says, باب الاستسقاء. So we'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Istisqa and khawf are very, very. So next class, inshallah, because istisqa is very, because a lot of it is du'as and stuff, and khawf, basically, pray on your own. So it's very easy to get through, inshallah. So, just come prepared. And then we'll get to the opening of janaiz bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.